Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're joined here today by Dr. Al-Tikriti. He is an activist, a hostage negotiator, but primarily he's the CEO and founder of the Cordoba Institute, which seeks to bridge the gap between the Western world and the Islamic world in a fashion that is beneficial to both parties. He's been very active for the past few decades, mashallah, and you all might have seen him. But in today's context, particularly, I think it's very poignant and important to speak with somebody like you. Sheikh, how are you?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, brother Amanullah. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure.
How are you, Sheikh? How are you doing?
I'm fine, alhamdulillah. The sun is out in London, and that is always an event that calls for high spirits and enthusiasm, alhamdulillah.
I can imagine having visited and always returned gloomier than before. I'm glad to hear that the sun is out, and I hope you can enjoy your day. Since we mentioned the Cordoba Foundation, I think it would be best to start with the simple question that what is the Cordoba Foundation? And what are some of the goals that you trying to achieve in a broader sense? And what sort of hiccups are you getting, and where do you think you're succeeding?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The Cordoba Foundation next January will be celebrating its 20th anniversary. We were established in January of 2005. And the reason why I came up with the concept of the Cordoba Foundation was I had been leading the demonstrations in London, the anti-war demonstrations against the war in Afghanistan, against the war in Iraq, and millions of people responded. The demonstration that I co-chaired and organized in February 2003 still is the largest in Britain's history. 2 million people marched that day against the war in Iraq. And there was this coming together of people from all across society, from all walks of life, from all ages and the like, and all saying things that you would hope would influence government and the decision makers. Yet, we all know now that obviously the government chose to ignore all of that, regardless of the proclamation that we are a democratic society, democratic country. And we went to war, and the rest, as they say, is history. And it's history still unfolding. I mean, Iraq still is a country that is hit by incredible devastation and failure. And there can be no question that people like Tony Blair, people like George W. Bush must be accounted for as war criminals, as people who defied the international community, the United Nations Security Council, who defied their own people and their protests, and committed a war that had absolutely no aim or objective but to decimate the country in question, and to create millions of victims as a result, and to start and trigger a second wave of violence across the entire region. So after that, I started thinking, okay, so what good is all of this doing? And I thought to myself that maybe one of the things that we're missing, whilst we have the streets, and every time we called for a demonstration, whether it be for Palestine, whether it be against the war in Iraq, whether it be against Islamophobia and racism and the such, hundreds of thousands of people would come out from all walks, Muslims, non-Muslims, Arabs, non-Arab, everyone. But the decision-making circles, Westminster in the case of London, and the European Union in Brussels, we didn't have ways of connecting with them in ways that were influential, i.e., I was thinking of a lobby. We didn't have a lobby. And therefore, the Cordoba Foundation, when established in 2005, it had, I would suggest, three main objectives. The first is to bridge the missing channels of understanding, how the West perceives Muslims, how Muslims and the Muslim world perceive the West and know how to deal with the West, but also try to get clear channels of information and reality. Because at the time, when we spoke to politicians after the Iraq War, they would all say, "Oh, we made a horrendous mistake." And by the way, I mean virtually 90, probably 95% of politicians whom I met in the years after, they would say we made a horrible mistake in Iraq. But when you say, okay, so why did you vote for the war when you had the chance? They would say, well, we didn't know. Okay, so you presume that if they did know, that they would make a different kind of decision. So that was one objective. The other objective, and that is very, very important, and this is something that I feel is relevant even today. Back in the 90s, there were two social scientists in America that came up with theories that shaped, at the time they were dismissed. But then after 9/11, in 2001, they started to become extremely influential. Those two social scientists were Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History, and Samuel Huntington, who wrote about the clash of civilizations. Now, all of a sudden, after 9/11, all of a sudden people started saying, well, hang on, 10 years ago, someone called Samuel Huntington spoke about this. So there is apparently this clash, this inevitable clash of civilizations, where Islam cannot coexist with the other. So the Cordoba Foundation, in a way, was an attempt to defy that particular narrative. And the choosing of the name Cordoba, by the way, which has a very strong Muslim resonance, of course, but you have to understand, in Arabic, Cordoba or Cordoba is essentially the epitome of the European metropolis. It's a European city. It's a European civilization. And its impact on Europe is immense. I mean, we can talk about the Alhambra Palace or the Masjid, the Grand Mosque of Cordoba or Seville or Toledo, all of that. But in actual fact, the impact on the way of life in Europe, the etiquette, music, art, poetry, on architecture, on philosophy, on laws, the codification of laws, on every single facet of European life that we claim today. In fact, Al-Andalus, and Cordoba specifically, was one of the most important driving elements that created the French Revolution. And it changed the course of history, particularly in Europe, but all across the world forever. So the impact of Cordoba was sought very, very much, and the name was deliberate in order to, first of all, bring to attention the role that Islam and Muslims had in creating the modernity, if you wish, or modern Europe, but also in order to remind people that people can coexist, did coexist. You had Muslim rulers with Jewish, Christian advisors and ministers, and who created one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. In fact, only recently I was there. And again, thousands upon thousands upon thousands from all over the world flocking to the remnants of Muslims and the remnants of the Andalusian civilization in Spain until this very day.
No, I think that was a beautiful introduction to the Cordoba institution. And I think that the Muslim audiences are more likely to pick up on the idea of the European style metropolis that was Al-Andalusia and Cordoba specifically. And it's a good way to reintroduce these ideas into the European zeitgeist, because you find that Islamic civilization, Islamic thought has been purposefully alienated, otherized. It's one thing to talk ill of us or to create media that portrays us, or literature in the case of the Clash of the Civilizations or the end of human history, those kinds of books, to portray us as something of a threat, an external threat to Europe. That's one thing, but to ignore us completely, I think, is much worse. And I think the latter has happened more than the former, in that we've sort of been erased from the collective memory of Europe, whereas we've had a huge role in forming each other's identities in today's context. And I think
you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, one of the lies, if I may, and forgive me for interrupting, brother, but one of the lies that is often perpetuated at the behest of even politicians and prominent intellectuals is that Europe is constructed upon a Judeo-Christian heritage, whereby the role of Islam and Muslims over 800 years, at least, of Islamic influence, of Muslim influence on every section of life, including creation of hospitals and health systems and public transport and the like, is one of the greatest crimes against history. And obviously what this does is that it separates the psyche, the European psyche, from what is essentially his or her origins. I mean, Islam and Muslims are part of every European's origins, whether they like it or not, whether they choose to accept it or not, that is fact. But the fact that today this perpetuation of a lie, that it is mere Judeo-Christian constructs that built Europe, that is wrong. And in fact, I could actually go further to say that it was Europe that went as much as it could in order to eradicate Jews and Jewishness and Judaism from Europe. And hence, we have partly the problem that we have today.
In Palestine, yes, unfortunately. But I suspect that NATO's Europe is a Judeo-Christian project. Now, in the sense of the lobbying and the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of Europe. And you recently probably dealt with this character, this Tommy Robinson character, who's some sort of IDF character who's actually masquerading as a British-born. He's British-born, but he's masquerading as sort of a local homegrown sort of hero who's anti-immigration, but in essence, he's anti-Islam. And you find whenever you check the threads with these sorts of things, they always go back to this NATO-style Judeo-Christian Europe, which is basically Israeli foreign policy being pursued by European parliaments and European intelligence apparatus. It's very unfortunate. And I think that not only from a historical perspective, but also in an immediate sense, in the past 100 years, Europe's identity has also been shaped by Muslim immigration, which is partly a product of the colonial project because of the cheaper labor and the lack of population in Europe after the world wars. There's all these sorts of arguments. And in industrial society, there's just a lower rate of birth. There's all sorts of factors to it, but even in the immediate past of the last 100 years, European society has been very much molded by their Islamic world immigration and the interplay between those civilizations, as you see in a London or a France, in a Paris, in Brussels, you name it. So even that identity now being otherized or exclusively otherized, yani not just any immigration, but immigration from the Muslim world, in the context of the Palestine issue, I think is a real tragedy, because you see a sort of a sleight of hand sort of trickery that they do, where when you want to talk about Palestine, the issue suddenly becomes about immigrations and boats coming across the Mediterranean coast, as opposed to an international war which is being funded and financed by European citizens' taxes, by Western citizens' taxes, which I suspect if they knew the details of that war, they wouldn't be very interested in financing it.
No, what you say is all correct, and I'd like to try to create some sort of thread. The first element that we must always be aware of is the fact that historical events particularly, are somehow connected. Sometimes they're very clearly connected. Something happens as a resulting consequence of something else happening. And sometimes they need to be looked at. They need to be examined in order to see the connection. One of those issues that we live and suffer today, and I mean everyone, by the way, East, West, North, South, we all suffer from. And that is the legacy of colonialism. That's something that we can't dismiss. We can't say, well, that happened 100 years ago, so it's really irrelevant. It's extremely relevant. And when you talk about immigration, waves of migrants that came essentially from the Muslim world, whether it be the Middle East, whether it be North Africa, whether it be Central Africa, whether it be from the Indian subcontinent and Pakistan and Bangladesh and the such, when you talk about, you can't dismiss the role that colonialism had in those waves of migrants. You see, we sometimes see this as some sort of favor. And by the way, I've met people who hold positions of leadership within various communities, Muslim communities, here in the UK, across Europe, even in America, albeit to a lesser degree, I have to say, who, whenever they hold an event, they could be holding Miladun Nabi, okay? At the end, they need to, it's like a staple, saying, we would like to thank the local authorities or the local police or the local council, the such, for allowing us to hold this event. And how many times have I attended international conferences held in Germany or France or London or wherever, and at the end, in the final statement, we would like to offer our gratitude to the authorities for allowing us in, allowing us to hold with extreme ease. And it's often sickening in a physical sense. But
sorry to interrupt
unfortunately,
you.
it's
such a deeply internalized kind of colonialism that you can't even work your head around it, because
absolutely.
Yeah, we're so bound by our spatial temporal realities that it's sort of impossible to escape our own skin. But it makes your skin crawl when you see that.
Amanullah, that I'm someone who has lived all my life in Britain. Okay, I turned 56 yesterday, by the way. The 9th of September was my birthday. Yesterday I turned 56.
Mashallah,
I've been in this country.
Happy birthday to you.
Barakallah fi, Jazakallah khair. I have been in this country since I was 2 years old. So that's 54 years. I think I can speak for the United Kingdom, or for British society, or for British.
That depends. That depends on how often you eat fish and chips.
It depends. Or how often I support the England team again when it plays against Bangladesh or Sri Lanka.
And where do you stand on mushy peas?
The thing is, sometimes I meet people, and of course, listen, we're grateful for the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have an incredible system, a health system in the UK, which is almost unparalleled around the world, and that is the NHS, the National Health Service. It's now crumbling. They're pulling it apart because they want an Americanized private system whereby people pay and they make billions. We're not going to go into that. However, when people go into hospital, they get treated, they get given medicine, they get given their scans and tests and everything, and then they walk out without having to put their hands in their pockets, not a single time. Many of my friends are in disbelief. They leave the hospital doors and they say, we haven't paid. And I say, no, you don't pay. And they walk and they're hesitant. They're looking behind themselves, thinking that maybe they're going to be pursued by police for not paying. That is a great gift. But, and I am all for the NHS, and I am all for investing in the NHS. However, we have to remember something very important. The NHS was built upon the riches stolen from our lands, from our countries. That was how Britain can afford this system whereby, everyone who lives on these islands can afford to check into a GP or a clinic or a hospital whenever they need to, and then leave fully served without paying a single penny because of monies taken from the colonies, our country, your country. So this is something we need to start to appreciate and understand, so that we then understand that when the government, and I'm not talking about this or the previous or the one previous to that, I'm talking about successive governments using the case of immigrants in order to explain their own political and economic and social failures. When they do that, we mustn't be fooled. We need to understand that for hundreds of years, the Brits, as well as the French and the Belgians and the Dutch and the such, they colonized our countries. They sucked our lands and our people dry. They killed our ancestors. They wiped out our villages. What they did to the Indian subcontinent is horrendous. If you look at just the figures, it's horrendous. Yet now
45 trillion pounds from India.
It's
45 trillion pounds. It boggles the mind. It boggles the
Boggles the
mind.
mind. It means that if the Brits did absolutely nothing but live very, very well, not gain a penny in terms of effort or jobs or occupation for the next 100 years, that would still be enough for them. It's immense. So we need to understand the kind of dynamic that ties us with, let's say, our host countries, albeit I hate that expression, but these countries which have become ours, which we're serving through also our hard work. You go to any hospital today, anywhere in the UK, and you are likely to find that over 0.5% of the staff working that hospital are immigrants from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, from all over the world. So we need to understand this kind of relationship so that then we can respond intelligently to the accusations of the racists and the xenophobes and the likes. And we understand where we stand today. We Muslims, our place in history, and I'm talking about modern history, I'm not talking about ancient history, by the way. Modern history, I mean, in the last 100, 200 years. We need to understand, first of all, our lands were occupied in the most grotesque ways. What France did to North Africa, to Morocco, to Algeria, to Tunisia, to those lands, is beyond words, beyond description. Until now, you can go to Paris and visit the Humanity Museum, and you will find the skulls of tens of thousands of Algerians who dared defy the colonialists and try to defend their homes and their lands. Their skulls are on exhibit. The French aren't hiding anything. It's not a secret, by the way. It's not something that we need to dig into the archives to find. It's there. You go. And on most days, as far as I understand, the last time I dared and went, it was for free. So anyone can go and see the skulls of the Algerians with, by the way, dates, with places, with locations and regions. It is there. It is shameless. The way in which the colonialists behave in regards with the old colonies is absolutely shameless. And by the way, we talk about them then leaving, the Brits leaving, the Raj, for instance, leaving, and the French being kicked out of Algeria or such. But what they left behind was so grotesque that until this very day, we suffer that particular legacy. We still have rulers who don't represent us, but rather represent the old colonies, the colonialists. We still have our riches being taxed for no reason whatsoever, but because that was the condition of the French and others, that we will only leave your lands and give your homes back if we are to charge you 50, 60, 70% of your GDP every single year. That was the condition. We still suffer that. At the same time, by the way, there was another side which we also seldom talk about, and I think now is extremely relevant to mention. And that is that during that time, Europeans were horrid to their minorities. They constantly bash us about our minorities. The Europeans, for hundreds of years, the disabled, those of a complexion that was slightly lesser of being pale, the Jews, anyone who worshipped in a different way than the prescribed church, those were dealt with pogroms. Those were dealt with persecution of the obscene sort. Whenever those, and particularly I'm going to focus on the Jews of Europe, where anti-Semitism was born here in Europe, those Jews, after every wave, starting with the Spanish Inquisition and ending with the Holocaust, every single time they would flee to where? To Muslim countries. They would flee to North Africa. They would flee to the Eastern Mediterranean. They would flee to Southern Arabia. They would flee to Muslim countries where they would find warmth, safety, security, and prosperity, where they lived, prospered, had children, created their own systems, cultural and the such, and they weren't interfered with. That's something that needs to be absolutely asserted in the kind of narrative that we find today, where racists, unfortunately, are having the biggest microphones and having the loudest voices, including the likes of Tommy Robinson, a very, very, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to call him grotesque, but then I give him too much importance. He's not that important. It's just that he has backers and those who pay him thousands upon thousands of pounds every single month and tell him to do, and he will just do. So it's that kind of relationship, that kind of status where we are today. And without understanding the dynamic of history, the dynamic of geography, the dynamic of economics, and where we fit in all of that, I feel that we are always going to be on the back foot.
No, I think that a lesson in colonial history is due, and I think you've done a fair share of that just now, and the impacts of our colonial history. Beyond just the scope of educating politicians and the general public about the effects of our colonial past and how we can mend our relationship with the Muslim world and the Western world, how do you go about it practically in terms of lobbying politicians, seminars, I suspect, putting out material? Do you advise in academics in universities? What is the methodology for the Cordoba institution? And then we can move on, inshallah, to the issue of Gaza.
Well, I mean, let's be honest, lobbying is mainly tactical. It's something that you need to solve today. So it's not something that's strategic. It's seldom strategic. There are some strategic elements to it, but essentially it's something that is happening today. You want a particular position of government on this issue today, and then you move on to the next issue, and so on. So it's not strategic in nature. But I'm a very big believer in that we need efficient, professional, competent lobbyists on a variety of issues. We can talk about the very overt, such as Palestine or Islamophobia or Islamic terrorism or the such, and policies on these issues. But then there are the smaller issues, such as in the UK, we have a very big issue called Prevent, which is a security strategy that targets the Muslim community. This is affecting thousands upon thousands of families up and down the country simply because now a school teacher is not qualified until he or she goes through a Prevent training, saying that, well, if you see certain signs of a 5-year-old kid, then you have to refer them to the Prevent program. And therefore, the entire family becomes totally obliterate, their lives becomes totally, upside down as a result of this referral. GPs, if someone comes to you and you feel they have certain signs, you refer them. So now we have what in slang is called grass. We have grasses in the GPs that we go in order to seek help, our treatment for. We have grasses in our schools where we send our children and the such. This is creating a society that is divided, that is in fear of one another. And this is a huge problem. However, on lobbying, coming back to lobbying, I mean, one of the things I've learned after more than 20 years of doing this is that, unfortunately, this tactic, we are competing on extremely uneven grounds. Of course, there are within politicians, there are those who are good-natured, who would favor the interests of many over their own, who would, for instance, think about the environment over financial gains and the such, but they are few and far between. And unfortunately, we're always playing an uneven game. In lobbying, people, the first thing they ask about or they question is, well, what do they stand to gain? So either financially, materially, or whatever, you have to prove to them that by changing their minds or adopting something which you're telling them is right, you immediately start negotiating on what kind of gains they can make on a personal note. And that's problematic. The other problem is that the framework within which we're working is something which is always engineered against us, unfortunately, against, let's say, the people. And today, maybe a few years ago, I would have been speaking more or less about Muslims. But now, in light of the global movement that has emerged in favor of Palestine, I talk more widely than the Muslim communities. I'm talking about people. I'm talking about the students. I'm talking about people of all faiths, all religions and none, who have now are looking at what's happening in Palestine, seeing the positions of their governments, and thinking to themselves, my word, who are we? What do we believe in? What are our values? Am I proud to be an American? Am I proud to be a Brit? Am I proud to be a French or a German in light of my government giving succor to the genocidal machine in Israel? So what I'm trying to reach at is the fact that we do need to work hard at trying to create a relationship. However, we must never ever accept that relationship to be one of being of a lower standard than sort of a servant to a master. That's not how relationship is built. That's not how negotiations are built. In my occupation as a hostage negotiator, and it's alhamdulillah, it's not a full-time thing. Otherwise, I would have gone crazy. But I always learn that whenever I feel that whomever I'm negotiating with sees themselves as having the upper hand, I need to consider walking away, because that's not a negotiation I can have. So it's important that whenever we're negotiating, that we have parity. And we understand, through understanding our history, through understanding our legacy, through understanding our importance and weight and heft to the West's economies, to the West societies, to the West stabilities, to the West's future development and prosperity. When we understand this, then we can have that kind of discussion over the causes and issues that we want to discuss.
I think it's very appropriate that the power dynamics between the two parties has to be addressed, the imbalance of the power especially, because I think we start off from a weak foot, and then obviously the infrastructure for lobbying, the way the political infrastructure works, it's a pay-to-play system, and unfortunately I don't think we can organize the same kind of resources that Israel can do, maybe, or other such countries or groups lobbying for their policies and their their kind of law that they want implemented. I think that competition is quite obvious and quite clear, and I think addressing that to the general public is now equally as important. And I think you said it very appropriately that you're not just speaking for Muslims now. There's a whole class of disenfranchised people in the Western world who are not only frankly sick of the wars, are also disgusted by them now. Now they're actually physically disgusted by their patriotism or their pride in their own country, their identity. They're hurting economically, financially. A lot of the infrastructure that they might have enjoyed, like the NHS that you mentioned, has been bled dry in an artificial sort of way to bring in these more privatized, more profitable versions of things that can work for free or through public financing. In America, homelessness, a lack of education, debt, crushing debt, a lack of job opportunities. These sorts of things were unimaginable, Yani, when I was growing up, and I'm sure you 20 years ago, 30 years ago couldn't have imagined this. I think the chickens have come home to roost, and there is a sizable population in the Western world that I think is willing to communicate with us across cultural lines, and I think platforms like Cordoba are very important in this, and I'm very glad you're doing this work, alhamdulillah. But there is a funny side note I would like to ask. How did you get into hostage negotiation, and what is this whole business?
Totally by mistake. Totally by mistake. In 2005, this was at the height of the post-Iraq war, and every now and then we were hearing about Westerners being kidnapped, and then huge ransoms being asked for, and sometimes not even asked for, but then people were killed and such by their kidnappers. And in 2005, in November, a group of 4 Christian peacemakers who went to Baghdad in order to have a look around. It was very foolish of them, I have to say. One of those 4 was a friend of mine. He was a retired radiologist from where I live, actually. I mean, his house is just down the road from where I am right now. And his name was Norman Kember. And he was part of the anti-war marches and demonstrations. And he was one of those. There was another American and 2 Canadians. So I was asked by the anti-war movement to travel to Iraq and to make an appeal on the media. Maybe, someone on, one of the kidnappers would be watching TV at the time. And I would send a message that these people are friends. They're not part of the American-British military alliance. They're not part of the occupation of Iraq. They are very much friends of Iraq. In fact, I know for a fact, I was speaking to Norman Kember's wife before I left, I knew that he was going because he was looking to help establish a hospital for children in Iraq. So I went for that purpose and nothing else. I appeared on a number of TV shows, on a couple of radio shows. I did a couple of interviews with journalists, and I was about to leave. And by the way, that visit was my very first since I was a kid to Iraq. So it was also, coming to familiarize myself with the land of my.
It was home.
Yeah, it was in a way. I have to say it was fairly traumatic because the country was in ruins, absolutely in ruins. But anyway, so I was about to leave, and I was literally packing to come back to London after I had fulfilled all my media duties, and then I got a phone call. And the phone call led to a meeting, led to my trip being delayed, led to me then traveling to Amman in Jordan in order to conduct a meeting, and then coming back, and so on, for about 3-4 months, on and off, until they were thankfully released in March of 2006. After that, it appears that I got a little bit of fame. And then someone called me from Libya saying that his daughter had been kidnapped and can I help? He didn't know where to turn to. So I started by helping him with the local authorities, and it turned out that I was dealing with the kidnappers directly, and alhamdulillah, she got released, and then it just grew from there. So it's nothing I studied for. It's nothing I had dreamt about doing. It's nothing that I had aspired to be. It's a very, very, very mentally and physically draining work. It's something that it's only the mercy of Allah that guides you, because a wrong word here or there could lead to someone dying. And that's not something that I look forward to. But alhamdulillah, till now, I have been involved in 28 negotiations, 21 hostages released, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, I continue to do some good work in this field.
MashaAllah, Sheikh, Barakallah Feek.
Alhamdulillah.
That's pretty amazing lore. I'm not going to lie. Your grandchildren have very fascinating lore to look forward to when considering their grandfather. May Allah bless you for this as well, in this life and the next, inshallah. I suspect that your calm demeanor, mashallah, you're very erudite, sort of very sort of calm, sort of stoic sort of character. I think Allah has built you for this, and I hope you can negotiate the ummah out of this situation that we're in with the use of the Cordoba institution. Considering that we're in a very tight spot, especially when it comes to the issue in Gaza, the war in Gaza, it's almost a year now, and we'll be coming round to the 7th of October again in a month's time or so. We've talked about the Western world and the kind of lobbying work you're doing and what we can expect from Western peoples as well as their governments, because we must separate the two, inshallah, because of the I don't think that Western civilization is a monolith, and I suspect that you don't either. But the response from the Muslim world, the Ummah at large, has been very different, I suspect, to prior responses in the last 100 years you would have gotten for such a conflict. How pleased or disappointed have you been with governments, with people? What have your interactions been like? Has the Cordoba institution, have you yourself had trouble communicating with governments in the Muslim world? What do you see going on within the Middle East, especially what we call the Middle East, yani the Arab world, when it comes to a full year of full-scale genocide in Gaza?
I mean, obviously, this is the story of our time. And, when history is written and the 21st century is spoken of, I have absolutely no doubt that Gaza and the 7th of October 2023 will be amongst the top stories and the top landmark and game-changing stories of this particular time, simply because we're living it, and we're living the horrors of it every single day, and therefore not realizing the enormity of this of this event doesn't it means that we need to focus on where we are at. And I think that what's happened and what has been happening now for over 11 months has changed the entire world. And I say this not out of either bravado or being dramatic. I say this really because, first of all, there are things that I see, feel, hear, touch every single day. And secondly, because of what I follow and the kind of impressions and reactions I'm finding from friends, from people I know who are slightly distant, as well as from people on the other side. On the other side, I mean on the wrong side of history. There's no argument in that Gaza changed everything. It changed people's perceptions. It changed people's perceptions of themselves. And this is probably the biggest shift that has happened. I mean, we could talk about the tens of thousands killed by Israel. We can talk about the hundreds of thousands injured. We can talk about the wiping out of an entire city that's used to house 2 million people. We can talk about that, of course. However, probably the biggest shift that has happened, and this is what, in my absolute conviction, will lead to the failure of Israel, and probably even to the downfall of Israel, is the fact that this has changed how people perceive their entire reality. And I talk about themselves, their beliefs. I'm talking about who they are, who they belong to, their countries, their countrymen, their governments, the ideologies that govern what we call the international community or international world order, international law, everything. The media, the banks. People are asking about everything. They're bringing into question everything as a result of what happens in Gaza. And it might be extraordinary to make such a proclamation, because if you were to unfold the atlas of the world, you would barely see Gaza. You wouldn't even see it. But this point, this dot on the world atlas has impacted every single spot on that entire atlas. And that is something that we need to take stock of and think about and plan about how to capitalize, how to bottle so that this does not wither, does not die out, that this kind of charge that we are seeing throughout the world is something that we can maintain. The people, this yearning for change. I am meeting, only yesterday, I had a lecture with one of the university encampments, and young people of 20, 21, 19 years old asking serious questions about, their standing in the world, about how they could look themselves in the eye and say, I need to focus on my studies, when they know that their brothers and sisters are being killed in that. And we're not talking about Muslims, by the way. These are Johns and Joannas and the such. We are talking about people of all faiths, all religions and the such, who are now looking at what's happening in Gaza and seeing that they can't live their lives like they do every time. I'm not big on social media, but those around me send me often clips of whom they consider as influencers, all saying that, listen, we thought that the most important thing was to get the new iPhone or the flashiest car or the biggest diamond or the such, but now after Gaza we realize that is nothing, that there are things that are far more important in life. We're listening to people who are questioning their governments, whom before, if you were to question government, they would look at that as an act of treason, and they would refuse that absolutely. We're seeing celebrities, Hollywood celebrities. One of, my favorite actors, for instance, John Cusack. I mean, John Cusack has gone on this sole campaign on his own, fighting the cause of Palestine, and absolutely leaving no bridge behind him. He has burnt all his bridges, and he has done so voluntarily, willingly, keenly, every single day. Susan Sarandon, who speaks at every demonstration and speaks of the complicitness of her government in the crimes being committed. We are seeing the BDS movement, the kind of hit that the value of stocks of Starbucks and McDonald's and KFC are taking, and how people are telling their friends off. How on earth can you sit there and sip off your Coca-Cola? And telling, it's just absolutely mind-boggling, the kind of change, the kind of shift that we're seeing. And only on Saturday, we in the UK, we had the 18th national demonstration, where again, hundreds of thousands of people gathered from across society. This is something that's not going to go away. This will leave an indelible mark. The fact that we have universities such as Stanford and Columbia in America, who educate the future leaders of American society, the future generals of American armies, the future bankers of America, who now come out in droves, risk their seats at their universities in order to condemn Israel, is something which, will have a long-lasting impact and effect. What we are at right now and what we need to do is to see that the world is divided. Actually, those, Brother Amanullah, who have this obsession with carving up the world into 7, 8, 10, 12 spheres, and where we have Darul Islam and Darul Harb, and we have... Today, I see the world in two camps. The vast majority who are with haqq, whether they know it or not, but they are with haqq, with truth, with humanity, with dignity. And those who are not, on the sides of the Zionists and on the side of the 5% elite around the world who control the fate of the 95% others. That is how the world looks. We need to act accordingly. We need to build our alliances accordingly. We need to start changing the world and the evils that hit the world accordingly. Now we have the sons and daughters of the elite bankers who are coming out and saying, capitalism is wrong. Capitalism has only made a few rich and billions poor and impoverished. We need to capture those people, make them know that they are on the side of truth, support them, and push this movement for change forward. Now, what does this mean for Gaza? The people of Gaza, on behalf of the entire world, have taken it on themselves to be on the very front line, giving up everything, their entire lives, the lives of their children, their homes, their land, everything, for us to see the ills of the world, for us to see the evils of the global system, for us to have that tenacity to change everything. That's their battle. The question is now, what is my battle? What is your battle? What is everyone else's battle in order to create a better place of this world?
SubhanAllah, I think that's a very good estimation of what's going on, and that Hamas has exposed all of us, because we've all sort of known about the system and its ills, but everyone's been silent about it. And I think the battle lines have been drawn, and people have to figure out in the 21st century if they're going to be part of the right side of history, on the right side of history, if they're going to be part of this great personal as well as collective battle for the soul of humanity, for the soul of our species, our civilizations, to not only defeat this international monetary system, just the absolute corrupt sort of industrial class that we have in the top 5% as well, and not only that, but also to maybe abolish the vestiges of whatever colonial power that still exists, and for people to truly live harmoniously, as opposed to in a sort of a laboratory experiment in Europe or in America, for people to on equal terms and on equal footing, to be able to cross communicate, trade, and to be able to have relationships which are fairly balanced, inshallah. Allah has selected the people of Asham to bear with patience and with dignity the burden that maybe the rest of us could not, and have not stepped up to the plate to bear that burden. It's a very good question. I think the audience will be asking themselves tonight, inshallah, what is their battle and whether they're fit to fight it, inshallah. And I hope that the answer is somewhere with the haqq. In the overall situation, you found that the Muslim governments have had disappointing responses, and it seems that the Arab regimes, the Gulf regimes, were very interested in normalizing their relationship with Israel, and Pakistan usually follows in tandem with the Gulf regimes in terms of foreign policy, and I suspect a normalization process was happening quite rapidly. In the Emirates, I saw with my own eyes that they had special immigration desks at the airport for Israelis, and I saw dozens of Israeli families, and they weren't business people. These were people loitering around the malls, as was I, in a very typical sort of, ogling at the shoe stores and eating ice cream or whatever. It was a very normal sort of touristic sort of visit, as opposed to something more serious or on the level of the state. In Saudi, you saw that partially, and in Pakistan, even, you saw on some level there was talk of communication, increased communication with the Israeli authorities, and maybe a potential for trade. Alhamdulillah, in Pakistan, was shut down due to popular protest. People were very, very mad, and when they go down a couple of points in popularity, the politicians and the state, they immediately revisit their PR or their campaign. Overall, the response was quite muted. The states that would classically have spoken about the Palestine, maybe Saudi, maybe a Turkey, maybe Indonesia, a Malaysia, and a Pakistan, they had a lukewarm response at best. How do you, as a Muslim in the West, find yourself sort of in this divide, in this sort of as an arbitrator almost between the West and the East in this sense? How do you find the criticism that, if this is your problem, why don't you guys deal with it? Yani, and what has been your communication with Muslim governments, if any?
Well, I mean, you see, you mentioned the Middle East, which mainly we're talking about the Arab countries. You can add Turkey and Iran to the mix, but essentially we're talking about Arab countries, especially when we say the Middle East and MENA, for instance, the Middle East and North Africa. We're talking about, generally speaking, the Arab countries. You have to understand, and the audience needs to also understand, that the Arab world was created 100 years ago in very, very contentious circumstances and in very, very contentious contexts. In fact, I would suggest that every single one of those 22 countries or 23 countries, I've lost count, what's the latest figure? But let's say 22 countries, Arab countries, that make up something called the Arab League. Every single one of them was created and was born with an enormous stigma and crisis hanging over their heads. And this remains until this very day. Because it was an abnormal birth. And therefore, countries who celebrate their independence days are just fooling themselves and fooling, their own people into thinking that somehow they are independent. There is no independence in the Arab world, in the MENA region. There is no independence. In fact, the colonial era has not only left some ugly remnants, but it has created an animosity between the brothers and cousins across the line that they drew on a piece of paper. And it becomes laughable. When you hear about that Algeria and Morocco sever diplomatic relations. I mean, you want to laugh, but you also want to cry, and you think to yourself, who are the buffoons who are calling the shots here? I mean, for instance, when Iraq and Kuwait went to war, my word, My word. I mean, how ridiculous is this? When and so on. I mean, we can carry on. We can count every single borderline between these countries where the same tribe exists. And all of a sudden, because of these lines, they are in different countries and
Then
they
you have
can't meet with each
Tamim, you
other
have
and
Banu
such.
Tamim in Palestine, you have it in Saudi, you have it in Iraq.
Saudi, you have it in Bahrain, you have it in Iraq, you have it in Yemen, you have it everywhere. It's laughable. And therefore, you have to understand, and this, by the way, is my own theory. I've spoken about it recently, but I need to do a little bit more research in order to make it grounded in academic nuance. But I will say this, that every single one of those kingdoms, fiefdoms, republics, whatever, that were founded by the Agreement of Sykes-Picot in 1919, every single one of them was told, here you are, you can have this piece of land where you can play king. But when we come to plant something called Israel, you need to shut up. That's my contention. I'm putting it in the most menial terms, in the most rudimentary terms. What I mean is, every single one of them, every single one of those regimes, I mean, to a varying degree, I mean, you have Qatar, but every single one of those Arab regimes knows that the harm, any harm that comes to Israel, will shake their own places of power. And as such, I don't worry too much about the countries that said nothing, despite the genocide ongoing just a few hundred miles down their roads. I don't mind those. I mind about those who actually collaborate with the Israelis. Those are the ones that really peeve me. I've come to expect nothing more from the vast majority of Arab regimes. But it's those who collaborate effectively, who open corridors in order to supply food and veg for the Israelis, lest they go hungry, lest they miss brunch in Tel Aviv. That's what really peeves me, and that's what we ought to...
And for the audience's sake, you mean namely the Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, and maybe even a Saudi, right? Would that be fair?
Of course.
That'd be a fair analysis.
Morocco as well.
Absolutely.
As well. Morocco
I mean,
as well.
The Moroccan hash dealers had more good sense to stop selling to Israeli tourists and Israeli businessmen, but the government did not.
I have confidence in the people, the overwhelming majority of people. And I yearn for the moment when the people will say, enough is enough, we're breaking loose, this isn't good enough. I'm yearning for that moment. We saw a flash of that in 2011 with the Arab Spring, and it was just a flash. I'm hoping that we will see something more sustainable and more controlled and more determined. And once that happens, by the way, anywhere in that region, that vast region, I assure you things will change forever, and they will change radically.
And I suspect that this time around, the ISIS-style foreign intervention will not be tolerated. I think after the experiment of Asham, the people have understood that there's a difference between an FSA and then, something like an ISIS or a Daesh. And those end up being tools for foreign intervention, for the Israelis or for Turkey or for Saudi, unfortunately. As well as the general balancing act that the Saudi-Iran proxy war that has been taking place across this world map. For as you mentioned, that for some countries it was, these are your boundaries, play king here for an Oman maybe, or for a Jordan. But for the Saudis and the Iranis, it's been unique in that the whole Muslim world has been sort of their playground because of the vast wealth that they have, the oil and gas wealth that they've accumulated, as well as the position geographically that they enjoy in the Muslim world, Iran and Saudi in particular. There's another balancing act that you hinted at, which is the people, and a lot of these regimes are desperate to try to sell them Vision 2030 or a new port or a new cinema hall or something ridiculous, or a new mall or a new skyscraper, because they have to balance between what the fitra is calling out to these people which is that our brothers and sisters are dying in Palestine, and our regime is not only silent, they're aiding the Israeli regime, the colonial project. And between that and then economic benefit. And to that, I would like to tell you, in the Emirates, we had some Pakistani students who were graduating from, these colleges, these American outsourced colleges that they have all over the Middle East.
Yeah.
And they were graduating from those. And in their graduation ceremonies, I think there were sashes of the Palestinian flag, or kafiyas, or shimars, or whatever. Some sort of symbols were worn that were indicating their protest for the Palestinian cause. This is just a few months back. They weren't just arrested, they were abducted, black bagged, and they were deported very silently, very hush-hush, in very hush-hush manners. And the Pakistani state here was set as a guarantor to make sure that these people don't speak out. But since it wasn't me, and I know these people, and I've spoken to them, I can speak out about it, and I can mention it on camera. So there's another aspect to this, and you've mentioned this in other discussions I've seen you, is that the overall sentiment for Palestine is much bigger than just, Gaza or the West Bank or the idea of a Palestine, a historical Palestine. It's become an ummah-wide conflict about why do these people rule over us? Whether it be a monarchy or a military style hybrid, which we get in Pakistan and Bangladesh and the like, a militaristic style, civil military bureaucrats and technocrats and some elite people who usually have industrial relations from back in the colonial days. That question has become so big that I found even in Pakistan, the state is cracking down on Palestine protests and Palestine movements, because that has become a symbol for something much bigger and something much, much more dangerous to them in terms of their stability. For that, in that light, do you think that institutions like Cordoba and individuals like yourself would be able to help better organize the different and disparate movements, protests, and the like, civil society movements in the Muslim world, they're all over the place, by the way, and help coordinate them better, so that maybe Muslims in the West can use their privilege and speak out in favor of the Pakistani Muslims who might have been arrested or abducted for protesting for Palestine and the like, because we had one very particularly vocal movement here, and they've had just the most brutal sort of crackdown against them multiple times, to the point they've almost fizzled out. To the point where they've almost fizzled out.
Firstly, those crackdowns are happening all over the place, by the way, and we saw for ourselves what the American National Guard was called into and onto university campuses for the very first time since Vietnam, in order to arrest members of staff, in order to manhandle students and protesters and the like, and to rip down banners. So, it's something that's happening around the world. And this, by the way, I think this is a part of the impact, the magnificent impact of Gaza on the entire world. That all of a sudden you're not seeing things differently. All of a sudden, what you describe happening in Pakistan, what I could describe happening, let's say, in Jordan, and what's also happening across Europe is also happening in America. So all now it proves my point that the world isn't desperate, isn't, these islands here or there. We needn't think of them in that terms. We only need to think of who is on the right side of history with truth and haqq and who isn't. That's all we need to do, because it turns out that those in Pakistan and America and wherever, they are on the same side. And that's very, very helpful. Now, coming back to the point you mentioned and regarding, bringing together or collaborating this whole movement, we have to realize that that this kind of shift in perception, I take from what you just said, in that Palestine, Gaza, are no longer about that strip of land, in the Sham. It's an idea now that is being adopted by people across the world. It's an idea of liberation. It's an idea of freedom. It's an idea of human dignity. And therefore, why is it that someone, for instance, it's happened in front of a friend of mine who was telling us just a few days ago, a lady who was going on about her business in central London, but having the kufiya, the Palestinian kufiya, around her neck. And she was confronted by a couple, a man and a woman, who started shouting at her for that kufiya. She said nothing. She was doing nothing. She was raising no banners. She was just going from one place to another. Yet that couple found it so offensive. And the reason is, and by the way, I was telling my friend, they're not wrong. They're not wrong, because that has now become a symbol of something far greater than Palestine. It's become a symbol for freedom, for liberation, for human dignity. And that is why governments such as the Arab government, such as many Muslim governments, unfortunately, are so scared of any kind of overt expression of solidarity with Palestine, because it's not about Palestine. It's not about Palestine. It's about them. You know, today, when you have TikTokers, for instance, talking about, my word, who are we? Or I see, you know, American or Canadian women in their 40s or 50s saying, I'm going to read this book called the Quran. We may be jubilant about this, about people getting to know Islam through the actual sources, not on the CNN or BBC, that's fine. But also you need to understand that this is a protest against everything. This is a protest against the system. This is a protest against the media. This is a protest against the mainstream. And that's why it is so dangerous. That is why these are game changers. So, yes, part of what I do is to collaborate and coordinate. We had certain days where we coordinated all the demonstrations on a particular day so that they cover the entire world. We coordinated efforts in order to strike on a particular day. Sometime a few months ago, we coordinated efforts in order to raise particular banners and to sound particular chants. There is that potential to coordinate on a global level. I understand that the price is hefty for some, far more than others. It's not just about losing their job. It's not just about being kicked out of their universities. It's possibly about them going to jail, maybe even worse. I understand that. And therefore, and this is something that, by the way, these autocratic governments, they understand fully. And that's why they try to cover that with these festivals, or these cinema halls, or these leisure centers, or these stars being brought and shipped all the way from America in order to entertain. It's not to supply entertainment to their people. It's in order so that they forget what is most important. Because once a nation, once a people start focusing on what's most important, believe you me, not a single one of those regimes will be in power within a few days.
SubhanAllah, and I hope that those are prescient words. I hope that they become the status quo at some point in time soon in the Muslim world, because we've been asleep at the wheel. We've been asleep at the wheel for a while, and people like you have been working for a few decades now, mashallah. And since your expertise was in the Iraq and Afghanistan war prior to the situation in Gaza, and you've led a lot of activist movements and protests and the effects of the war, what has happened to the Muslim psyche? You know, there was talk of an ummah, there was talk of the revival of the caliphate, because in essence, what we've been dancing around is the crisis of the caliphate. That's what we were talking about for the last 1 hour, or whatever the time that has passed. We were talking about the crisis of the caliphate, which would not only be beneficial to the Muslim world, but also beneficial to the Western world, that we would be able to. And again, when you say the word caliphate, it's very pie in the sky. It's it's a very lofty ideal to start the conversation with, which is why I delayed it to the very end. What do you think that energy that we had post-colonialism, that pan-Islamic energy in different forms and shapes, with the Hizb and with Jamaat Islami in the subcontinent, and with Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and sometimes it would turn violent, and sometimes it would turn ugly, and sometimes it would work out. We had all these kinds of energies across the whole map of the Muslim Ummah. But now a lot of that energy has been thrashed out in the war of terror, as I'd like to call it, the war of terror. What do you think that has done to the psyche of people below the age of 30 or 40 who've grown up with this idea of the war of terror? And how do we get out of this? Not only with the situation in Gaza being such a
Yeah.
game changer, which you're absolutely right. People who were bogged down in the technicalities and the particulars of the war of terror, it's like they've completely woken up within minutes, within seconds of the 7th of October. But overall, the effects have been bad. How do we deal with this? And what are the effects, by the way?
We have a new caliber of generation coming up, Brother Amanullah, and that fills me with optimism. And this new caliber sees things from a totally different perspective than the one afforded to me when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. And that perspective is one that has at its fingertips immense capacities of technology and communication and travel and mobilization and the like. So with this level of understanding that Gaza has afforded, with this kind of awareness of the self as well as the other, with this kind of appreciation of what is truly important. You know, about 10 years ago, the discussion of us fathers was, okay, how do we convince our children that it's not the most important thing in the world to have a Nike top or a Adidas streakers or whatever? Now, parents are coming to me, and this, by the way, this is my own personal experience. Parents are coming to me and saying, how do we calm our children down? They are too loud on Palestine. They speak all the time about Palestine. Let me give you the example of my own daughters. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. All they talk about when they leave school, when I pick them up, is my friend Lucy. I had a chat with her, and now she supports Palestine. But her problem is that her parents support Israel. And they're discussing amongst themselves. And I hear her elder sister saying, well, if you keep talking to her, maybe she'll be able to speak to her parents politely and to convince them of what's happening in Palestine. And I'm listening to them. And honestly, by Allah, I never had this conversation with them. This is a generation that has its own means of education outside of schools. It's finding its own ways. I think that we are on the doorsteps, on the threshold of something which is quite glorious. It's going to be very, very difficult, by the way. We're going to feel the crackdowns, come our way in the most democratic of countries. We're already seeing people, being cracked down upon in America, in Western Europe and the such. We're seeing human rights being curtailed. We're seeing restrictions on public expressions of thought and belief and the like. We're seeing all of that. We're going to see more. It's going, if we want radical change, we'll need to pay the price for radical change. However, I am extremely optimistic that the younger generation have what it takes, first of all, to connect with their peers around the world so that they form this kind of global awareness, this expansive understanding and appreciation of the world, the challenges they face, and they can start building their own thing. They know they don't need to inherit what we're going to pass down onto them. And therefore, I believe, you mentioned, for instance, Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, Al-Ikhwan, Hizb, all these. I think they built a solid base, building blocks. The most important thing we take, when we speak about the Khilafah, Akhi Amanullah, when I speak about the Khilafah, what I speak about are two things. First of all, the concept of the Ummah. The fact that we have 2 billion people who occupy this earth, who share the same faith, who share the same understanding and appreciation of the world. That is an immense, immense capacity, far greater than any oil fields or any gas fields or any uranium or any gold reserves or the such. This is immense. And that's why anyone who speaks of the Ummah is immediately lambasted as being, an extremist or some sort of, someone who ought to be fought. That's one thing. The other thing is a shared collection and set of values. And that shared set of values, while steeped in our Islamic tradition, I believe concerns all of humanity. Let me tell you this, Brother Amanullah. You know what the biggest challenge to British people today is? This is the great United Kingdom. This is the great Britain of the world. The biggest challenge we face today is that people can't afford their basic necessities. They can't afford to pay their heating bills. They can't afford transportation. The cost of living crisis is the crisis of today. They might trick people by thinking, there are immigrants crossing on dinghy boats, rubber boats from across France, and make them feel that this is the catastrophe that they should contend with. Actual fact, people can't feed their own children. We have, according to the government statistics, over 1 million children whom, if they don't go to school, meaning on weekends or holidays, they simply don't eat. They have the mushy peas that you speak of. That's all they have. They have nothing else. They have chips. That's all they survive on. Today we have food banks. Every single week, a new one opens, and longer and longer and longer lines of people who are desperate for the very basics so that they nourish their own. This is the real problem. And therefore, the victims of the system that the world is run by are all on our side. They are us and we are them. They all share with us the values. If you were to speak about justice, if you were to speak about fairness, if you were to speak about standing with the oppressed and the weak, if you were to speak about standing with the downtrodden, if you were to speak about all of those, everyone will come to your side. And therefore, the world is divided into the victims of the oppressive system that we live under, whether it be economic or social or political or otherwise. We are all victims. And we're talking about the concept of the ummah, the collective, the power of the collective. That's what we're talking about. With that, I feel that we have the capacity to change the world into a much, much, much better place, inshallah.
Barakallah feek, Sheikh. We've taken a lot of your time, and you've given us very, very deep things to think about. And inshallah, may Allah bless you and your work and your family. Is there a way for people to contact you, connect with you? How can they help out in the UK, outside of the UK? What would be the best way to connect with your work?
The website is thecordobaffoundation.com. Thecordobaffoundation.com. My name, Anas Al-Tikriti, is on Google, and my contact details are there, and everyone is more than welcome to connect with me.
We'll pin all of these things down, and I'm going to stop the recording, inshallah, in a minute. Thank you very much, sir, for your time, and may Allah bless you in your work, and inshallah we'll continue having these conversations whenever you can and whenever you have time for us, inshallah.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.